Hey everyone, welcome to another Power Monkey podcast. On today's episode, Chad and I interview Dr. Lenny Wiersma. Lenny is a professor of sport and performance psychology at Cal State Fullerton, and he is an incredible resource when it comes to sports psychology. He was actually recommended as a podcast guest by a former guest of ours, and I am so glad we had him on. From the moment we started speaking, I could tell we had something in common in the way that we approach things. I loved talking to him. I felt like I could kind of just delve into my own little personal experiences being an athlete and what it takes to get mentally strong. Lenny works primarily with extreme sport athletes, which are sports basically where your life is on the line every time you go out to compete, which gives a really unique perspective as to the mental game that goes into creating an athlete that can not only survive but thrive in those environments. And this was one of my favorite podcasts that we've done in a really long time. I learned a ton, some really useful examples on how to become more mentally strong that you can utilize as an athlete no matter what your starting point is. And it's the kind of podcast that I know that we can kind of stretch into 2 or possibly even 3 different podcasts. So I know we'll have Dr. Wiersma back on at some point in the future, but this is a great starting point, and I hope you guys enjoy it.
Dr. Lenny Wiersma. Hopefully I said that last name correctly. Thank you for joining us on the show today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. I tell you, psychology in general, just life in general, but of course for sports and in my own field of weightlifting, CrossFit as well, I'm just more and more interested in it. And I feel like it's kind of more and more what I have to do without really knowing a whole lot about it, but more and more what I have to do with my athletes. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. But I believe you're in Santa Ana, California. Is that correct?
Yeah, I teach at Cal State Fullerton. I'm a colleague of Dr. Galpin, who you just had on the show, I think last week or something.
Yep, absolutely. Awesome. How's everything out there? Everything kind of getting back to normal, or?
No, not at all. I mean, apparently we're starting to flatten a little bit, but we'll see where that goes. I don't have a lot of faith in my county at the moment, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm hunkered down. I mean, I said this back in March, this is going to be an endurance event.
Yeah.
And if you think we're going to get out of this anytime soon, it's just going to be tough. And so what we've got to do is we've got to be vigilant about our mentality, and we've got to be prepared. And, I always say, thinking about the future does not cause anxiety. It's trying to control the future that causes anxiety. And I think that we're starting to really, really see this play out when it comes to how people are having a hard time handling the longevity of this challenge. But it's an endurance event. And so we have to apply all that we know about the psychology of endurance events to our day-to-day lives right now. And that's what's really going to get us out of this whole thing. But anyway, so it's what it is down here. I'd sure like it to be a little bit better, but I'm prepared for the long haul too.
Yeah, those are definitely some great words to start with and a good way to summarize it. And you mentioned endurance event. It's an endurance event. And it just makes me think one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, you work with a lot of high-level athletes, professional athletes, Olympic-level athletes. And this is something I'm always curious about, and I've asked a few others about as well, is there any specific sport that you come across that just by nature of the sport, they have kind of the toughest or best mental game?
Toughest and best are 2 different things. I might have different responses for the toughest versus the best. I mean, it's all super relative. And I think when you really understand the mind of an athlete, in the end, it doesn't matter the other people's perception of how demanding a sport is. It's being at a certain level that's the great equalizer. I may believe that playing one sport might not be as psychologically demanding as playing a different sport, particularly sports in which you have a lot more on the line. When you talk about extreme sports, and if you make a mistake at the free throw line or kicking a field goal, it's going to feel awful, but you're still going to go home.
Right.
But if you're, a wingsuit flyer or a big wave surfer and you make a mistake, it could very well end it. So,
Mm-hmm.
it would seem as if the more riding on the line, the more demands they are. But the reality is, no matter what you're doing, if you're on a certain stage and you perceive that you have
Mm-hmm.
enough to lose, it doesn't matter the demands of the sport. It's just the reality is it's going to be tough. And so
Mm-hmm.
I personally believe that the sports that, there's more risk with respect to our physical lives. I think that can possibly carry
Mm-hmm.
a greater demand. But, I'm also not the person trying to sink a 7-foot putt when the whole world, it feels
Right.
like, is
Right.
watching. So I don't know if I answered that question enough. I think my job, and one of the most exciting aspects of my job, to be quite frank, is to really delve into observing the sport, being around the sport, being in the environment in which the sport is played or carried out, and doing my best to try to get a sense of what those demands are. And they're different for every sport, for sure. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
there's strategies that are going to cross over into the variety of activities. But that to me is fascinating. I mean, I look at your career, Chad, and your
Mm-hmm.
career, Dave, and I bet we could sit here for hours talking about the demands that each of you felt when you were competing at that level. And I bet you that there's going to be some that are going to be almost identical. And I bet you there's some that exist in one of
Mm-hmm.
yours experience that didn't in the other, but it doesn't make one more difficult than the other.
Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
completely agree with that. I think to be in the shoes of the athlete in the moment is very difficult to do. And, every sport has their own particular challenges. I think it's super interesting what you mentioned about sports that have their lives on the line. And I'm curious what got you into wanting to, delve into the psychology around an athlete that every time they go out into their sport, it's, am I coming home alive? Do you have experience in any extreme sport yourselves? You mentioned being a swimmer, but has that kind of gone into any extreme versions of swimming, or what got you specifically into the interest level revolving around that type of an athlete?
I think when I started in this career, which is really, the timing of when I went into it was pretty critical because the field was just really starting to form. And so I kind of got in at the right time, at the forefront of seeing now over the last 30 or so years how this field has really evolved. Probably going into it, I had the intention that a lot of individuals who were going into it had. I want to work with team sport athletes. I want to work with Olympic athletes, professional athletes, in some of your more traditional sports. And that's also where the field was kind of wrapping its head around. As I started to, really observe some of these other extreme sports that are going on, it really kind of piqued my interest. Long story short, the first real examination that I had in extreme sport was with big wave surfing. And there was a spot up in Northern California called Mavericks. And you may have both heard of Mavericks. It's
Mm-hmm.
one of the most interesting and frightening places to enter into the water on Earth. And I remember watching a documentary in 2004 called Riding Giants.
Oh, yeah.
And I was in the theater with my girlfriend at the time, and I'm watching it, and I said to myself, I have to understand this.
Mm-hmm.
I have to, and nobody was doing this type of research at all. So I got a sabbatical. It was the first time I was eligible for a sabbatical at Fullerton, and I was actually fairly surprised that the university awarded me a sabbatical to study surfers, but they did. And it started kind of an evolution of me really trying to grasp what are the demands in particular about big wave surfing, but then how do these demands translate into other extreme sports, but also regular sports too. And so it was sort of born out of me watching something and saying, I have to understand this, because I was having a hard time myself wrapping my head around what's going through the mind of an individual who's in that type of an environment. What would that be like? And I surf, and I've surfed in waves that for me were fairly scary, but the reality was I was going to swim out of the ocean safe at that level, but that's not the case for some of these people. So my second sabbatical was extreme backcountry skiers and snowboarders, those who climb really dangerous mountains and then try to attempt to ski or snowboard down them, or in a couple cases, wingsuit and then ski, and then wingsuit some more, and then ski
Jeez.
some more. And there were a lot of really interesting parallels between those worlds. So the unfortunate thing for me is I now have a different perspective of the psychology of doing some of those really extreme activities that in some cases is really difficult for me personally to be in a traditional sport environment that I know is stressful and that I know there's a lot at stake, but it's really not the same as it's been in some of these other environments and some of these other areas. But that does not at all downplay the stress that a person who's doing a task that in and of itself is not dangerous. There's still a lot at stake. It's this person's identity. It's this person's career in some respect. So I'm not downplaying that at all. But for me personally, being in certain environments, I'm a little bit more drawn to certain environments than others. I work with USA Swimming, and I work most with the open water group. And so that's, you take swimming for, a 25K, which is a 6 or 7 hour event. And last year, World Championships in South Korea, I was on the far end feeding dock in the lake during a typhoon. And, it was just, swimmers were getting pulled out of the water because the waves were unbearable. And that to me is fun. It's exciting. Yeah. So then to stand on the side of a pool deck and watch the swimmers go back and forth, you could see the difference in my experience. Not that takes away the importance of that, but so at any rate, you're going to have to keep me from going off on tangents. This is your show.
No, yes. Absolutely. And this is exciting. And also I'm curious, does it make you more likely to want to pursue a sport like that? Or do you see it now and say, thank goodness I'd like to be the athlete that's just in the pool and can swim laps and not have to worry about these crashing waves on top of me?
I mean, I have to be careful. We're all getting older. And so I have to, but it's really interesting though, because I do find myself, quite frankly, in situations that I'm using this logic. I'm using what I learned. So for example, I do a lot of backpacking, backcountry, hiking, multi-day backpacking trips. So I got out this summer and I was up in the Eastern Sierras, and I was with a good friend of mine, and there was a small group of us doing a fairly, it was going to be a pretty ambitious itinerary, and we had to go over a pass, and it was mid-June, so most of the snow had not yet melted, and we got to a point on the pass. We were probably about 200 yards from the summit. It's called McGee Pass, and there was a section that was really sketchy, where if you slipped in the snow, you would probably fall to minimally punctured lungs, concussion. Worst case scenario is you don't make it through that. So a good friend of mine and his son, who was very strong and very fit, just didn't have the right shoes on. He was hiking in basically Vans. I don't know if it was Vans, and so we had to assess the risk. We had to assess, okay, could we reasonably, all 6 of us, get across this snow portion? And I said, it's a risk reward ratio. Even if it's a 20% chance that one of us could slip, is that worth it for us to continue on with the path that we want to go on? I was using all of the understanding that I was getting from those athletes who were doing risk assessment on their own. And I was pretty adamant. It's just not worth that. Would it be fun trying it? Of course. Would I regret forever one of those kids sliding down that thing? Of course I would. So let's turn back and let's come up with a different plan. And you have to accept the fact that in life we have plan A, and we're not always presented with plan A. As a matter of fact, few times we are. So we have to be okay with plan B or plan C or plan D. So I guess a long answer to that response was I still find myself, even though I'm not doing the type of really dangerous stuff that the individuals I'm working with do, I still find myself applying it to a lot of really general life situations. And to me, that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, and the way that you're describing these things, it definitely reminds me of just general life. In general life, we all have different challenges that we face. And for some people, their, loss of a limb, for example, seems different than a broken arm. For example, you still have your arm. So it seems like the loss of limb is more extensive, and perhaps it is, but we as humans seem to rise to the level that we need to overcome the challenges that we face. And it's what that's reminding me of is these extreme sports. And there's definitely probably more to it. I mean, maybe someone that does an extreme sport has faced some sort of major tragedy in their life or something that led them to that. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit down the road here. But in talking about extreme sports and extreme challenges, I wanted to come back to what you mentioned in the beginning. You said tough would be different than best, or tough would be different than good for you if you define them. Can you define those for us? And because it seems like on the extreme sport side, they would have to be both, in my mind, very tough mentally and very good mentally. Is that the case?
Yeah, you raise a really interesting point with that. When you originally asked, if I recall, maybe 15 minutes ago or so, when you originally asked, is there a sport that has the toughest and best? I think I was seeing those together, and I was saying there's probably a distinction between the two of those things. When I think of tough, I think of what are the demands that I'm faced with, and these demands are entirely subjective. And you could line up 1,000 people who are faced with the identical objective demand, and 1,000 people might have a different subjective response to that. So when I'm thinking about tough, I'm trying to understand what are the demands in the environment. And but then when I'm thinking best, I'm defining that as the effectiveness of my mental approach to how it is that I'm going to cope with those demands. And of course, then the higher the level of toughness of the demand, the more sophisticated my approach to that is going to be. How am I planning for those situations? What am I going to do to regulate myself, to regulate the fear, to regulate the nerves, to regulate the excitement that I'm in? So I think there's a great correlation between the toughest challenges and the best responses. I don't think that's always the case. And one thing that actually stood out to me about some of the extreme sport athletes is I have not yet met with a single extreme sport athlete prior to me reaching out to them to study them who had ever done anything formally with sports psychology. And yet they're dictating these demands on their own. And I think it takes a pretty special person, and there's something about that person's psyche or mentality that draws them to these pursuits that is not normal. Even though they're very normal people in other situations, I think their psyche, their mentality. So, it's always a cliche to say, I learn more from the people I work with than I teach them. And I don't think that's always the case. But with that population, I definitely think it is the case, because in some cases they are dealing with some of the toughest demands. And in many cases, they are absolutely solid when it comes to, on their own, figuring out how to cope with those demands.
Right. And that seems curious to me, in the sense that these athletes have done these sports for a number of years without interventions from sports psychologists, and were able to kind of overcome the challenges through their own methods, right? Have you found it that you've been able to have a significant impact on their ability to kind of achieve new levels? Like if I look at somebody like Alex Honnold, who's, doing things that other people wouldn't even, like, you watch the movie and you're scared.
Yeah.
Do they have the ability to make you change the way that you approach? Like, do they give you tools and be able to say, wow, I haven't even thought about that from a sports psychology standpoint? You're creating methods to overcome just by doing it? Or do you feel like the tools that you've been able to kind of give to them have been able to allow them to achieve new levels of greatness? Because it's a very, very kind of curious balance, it seems like.
No matter how good you are at the mental stuff, you can always get better. It's right now, I think it's our brains are the ocean, and we know so little about the ocean. And I think that's the same thing with our brains. And so it's almost like the symbiotic relationship between an anemone and a clownfish, how they, they benefit greatly from each other. So when I have an opportunity to work with an extreme sport athlete, I am constantly pushing my understanding of these environments. And that's what they provide for me. And I might then provide some, what I consider to be fairly foundational tools that I can introduce to them so that they can use some of the things that we do know about our minds and our brains and how they interact in these environments with what they already know. With the big wave surfing, one of the really young surfers I worked with who started surfing Mavericks, this is in Northern California, at a very young age. He was a mid-teenager when he first started doing it. He had already won the Mavericks competition, which is no small task, before I started working with him. And so I tried to get a good sense of how'd you do that? What was your thought process? But the Mavericks competition subsequent to that was coming up. And so we met independent of my research, and I just wanted to give him small cues that he can use in those environments. And one of them was he wanted to have fun. He wanted to be in that surf in a competitive environment and have fun. He said he loves surfing. It's supposed to be fun. But then when he got into those environments, he forgot about that. So I believe very much in cues, visual cues in our environment. So I said to him, you're lying on this, 12-foot surfboard, and you know exactly where your face is at when you're lying on the board. So put a little marking on your board, put a little sticker, put a little, anything as a reminder. It's so simple. So I go to the opening ceremony, which is where all the invited surfers come, and they do this picture where they all stand with their big boards behind them. And he shows up and he's got a spray painted, or I don't know, hand painted smiley face, like huge smiley face on the spot of his board where he would most likely be looking. And I thought it was a really simple, dumb suggestion that he just grasped onto. And so, Dave, that's an example of something where I think, as good as you are, you can always do the little things a little bit better, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to get too much into an own personal experience with the mental side of a sport, but I think it's interesting to be able to say, what are some applications that the everyday athlete can be using in their CrossFit workout or in their home workout? What are some tools that you're applying to these, extreme sport athletes that an everyday athlete can use to be able to better their experience, make their time in the gym a positive one, but then also get the most out of their time? And that one seems like a very simple one. Come into the gym and give yourself a visual cue to put yourself in a better mindset. So I'm curious, maybe if you can give us one or two others that are very simple that maybe our listeners from across the board, maybe not just an endurance athlete, might be able to apply in their own training sessions.
I don't know if you've ever heard of metacognition. Metacognition sounds like a really kind of mystical new age term, and it's really not. Cognition is thinking, and metacognition is thinking about thinking. And that's my job. My job is to help performers, athletes, think about how they think, and then get a sense of whether their thoughts are helping them reach their goals or preventing them from reaching their goals. And I always say your mind can be a weapon or your mind could be a weakness. It's going to be one or the other. And so if I'm working with an athlete, and I know, Dave, you said I don't want to bring my own personal thing in this, but at the time at which you were competing, if you and I were to have an opportunity to meet, we would talk a lot about how you think. What are your triggers? When you performed your best, what led to that? In those moments where you felt like in retrospect you made a mistake or you let the emotions overwhelm you, what led to that? Because it's different for everybody.
Oh, yeah.
So a performer's ability to think about how they think is the starting point. And I always actually am extremely surprised when I have an opportunity to work with the level of athlete that both you and Chad were when you were at your prime, and how little time athletes think about how they think. And I think I have a great respect for the sports sciences, for your traditional biomechanics and nutrition and strength and conditioning and exercise physiology. But the great frontier, if we want to make our greatest strides in understanding sport performance, it's studying the mind more and studying the brain more. So it could be something as simple as, what sort of language do you use with yourself when you're in training environments that are when you're struggling? What are your thoughts? That this is referred to in our field as self-talk.
Mm-hmm.
And we're always going through internal dialogue. As I'm talking, both you and Chad are engaging in self-talk at this exact moment. Now imagine an environment that is stressful, that's exciting. Imagine all the phrases that you could be generating in your mind. And there's some great power in recognizing self-talk that can be effective for us and self-talk that's not effective for us. And what's effective for one person is not the same as for another person. So Dave, one of the things I would do would be to let's think about what we say to ourselves. Let's think about what we think when we're in situations when we're doing really well, or what are our triggers? What tends to trigger in us doubts? What tends to trigger in us fears? And then when those triggers are present, what's the language that we're using to get through those things? So most athletes, believe it or not, have a very passive self-talk where they think randomly about what they're experiencing without being really directed in that self-talk. So I think of self-talk as in different perspectives. If you're a writer, you can write in the first person, which is I. You can write in the second person, which is you. And athletes who think in the first person, I'm so tired, it's too hot in here, it tends to be worse than not thinking at all. It tends to be feeling sorry for yourself. It tends to be passive. But if we can learn to talk to ourselves in the second person, and there's a ton of research to back up everything I'm saying, but if Dave, I were to instruct you to talk to yourself, it would be much more effective for you than just listening to yourself. Talking to yourself is far more powerful. And then the third person perspective is listening to a voice in your head of somebody who you admire, who you respect, who you trust, talking to you. That is so far what we found to be the most powerful form of self-talk, is in a very influential voice. So this would be either a relatively short intervention that we would have, or a much longer intervention to try to wrap our minds around how we think. And in those situations, how can we train ourselves to think effectively versus in those situations where our brain becomes our own worst enemy, so to speak.
So
Sorry, that was a lot.
no,
I'm sorry.
yeah, and I just want to clear that up and make sure that that's really it's a great point, and I want to make sure our listeners kind of understand this. So self-talk can be critical, but can also be damaging if it's done incorrectly. It can exacerbate the chatter that's going on in the head and kind of lead you down the wrong path. And I've noticed that in myself as well, especially early on in my career before I started to get a better grasp of the importance of what's going on in your head and try to point you in the right direction. But essentially what you're saying is to try to look at it from that third person would be an optimal way, and to try to find the voice of someone who is influential or inspirational, or someone that you've always looked at as kind of a guiding voice, to be that person that's guiding you. Is that correct?
That's it. You got it.
Okay. All right.
And another thing to clarify about this, and there's a few things that my field has oversold. And by oversold, I personally think like we've sent the wrong message. For example, the importance of confidence. Thinking that you have to be confident to perform a certain way is a complete misnomer, and it sets athletes up for failure. Not if they don't feel confident, but when they don't feel confident. Confidence is fragile. Confidence is a minute by minute thing. And so that's one thing that we've oversold in our field, is the importance of confidence. The other is the importance of being mentally tough. And people use that term mental toughness all the time. Yeah, there are moments in which you really do have to grit through it. Of course, in life there are, of course. But performers are people. And if we don't allow ourselves to be fragile at times, if we don't feel sorry for ourselves at times, doing it the right way, then it could be a very damaging thing. You know, elite level sport is in the end not very mentally healthy. And, you know, I don't know if you saw that documentary on HBO.
I was going to bring it up. Yeah.
Recently, The Weight of Gold.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's something that we've known for a long time. And so
yeah,
if we have this expectation that we've got to be mentally tough, then that sets ourselves up for it. And another thing, the third thing, so I said we've oversold confidence. I think we've oversold mental toughness. We've also oversold the need to think positively. And I don't think I'm the first person to say that positive thinking can be useful, but not always. I don't like the distinction between thinking positively and thinking negatively. And this is super important. I think of the distinction with thinking effectively versus thinking not effectively. And in many cases, thinking effectively is thinking positively, but not always. And there are a lot of people, and you know, both of you who lived through the highs and lows of your sport, because that's what it takes to get to the level at which you both performed at. I'm guessing that there were a lot of times where maybe someone would have told you, oh, think positively. It's better to think positively. Whereas you may have been able to say things to you that you'd never say to another human being. And you may have responded really positively to that or really effectively to that. And I know athletes who, you know, in the end, an ultra endurance runner, for example, who you're at mile 82 and it's pitch black outside and you don't have any idea where you're at and you're hungry. And sometimes you got to tell yourself negative things to motivate you. So I have a feeling I'm going off on too many tangents, but when you summarize, Dave, the different self-talk perspectives, I think it was spot on. But I don't want to get lost in that, some of these misnomers of our field that I think we need to really be honest with athletes about.
You're touching to my heart right now. And things that, you know, I feel like checking off boxes in my own head that I found myself doing too. I always, and Chad, you can jump in here a second. I just want to, you know, mention my own competitive situation where, you know, I would try to compete in a really positive way and, like, you know, have fun and make sure you're absorbing the moment and try to be present. And sometimes those things would actually create negative environments. And thinking sometimes I would perform my best when I was angry. And I would say, like, just like curse myself, let's fucking go do it, you know, and like be angry and pissed off. And I would be at my best when I would compete in that type of mindset. And I think that falls in line with what you're talking about, is that it doesn't always have to be this like perfect environment where things are just so positive and that's what's going to lead to success. I think the idea of effectiveness is so important, and being, you know, maybe some people are effective by being more in a different mindset than someone else.
Yeah, from my perspective as
Dave,
well.
It would be like you. Sorry, Chad. Let me just say this real quick. I'm sorry, Dave. It would be like you using fire.
Yeah.
Fire can be an extremely effective tool, and it can burn you.
Yeah.
And so, you using anger, you have to know when it's fire. And if you learn how to do it the right way, then you can cook and you can, you know, you can warm yourself, you can do all these things, but you've got to be aware of when are the times where it's going to actually be dangerous for me.
Love it.
Anyway,
I'm
sorry, Chad.
No, you're good. And I mean, you can keep talking if you want to, because I'm just getting more and more excited over here about, you know, the things that you're talking about, because it's always good to hear, like, for example, if I hear some sort of study on squatting or the technique of the pull of a snatch or clean that relates back to what my body did naturally, it makes me feel good, right? So kind of what you're saying is you're talking about a lot of things that I feel like I learned on my own, because I had to be at the elite level. I had to figure at least a lot of those things out, if not the majority of them, to be able to compete at that level. And I try to relate those types of things to my athletes all the time, especially the ones that are trying to especially the ones that are trying to compete, just for anyone that's trying to, you know, lift the most weight over their head that they can, with the snatch and with the clean and jerk. And one of the things that I talk about a lot is that what, like you said, you don't have to believe to achieve. I don't think that. I don't think you have to have confidence. Like you said, it's good if you do. Great. If you can have that, then good for you. But I'm going to tell you right now, when I step out on the competition platform to this day, especially on my second and third attempt, I don't usually, feel 100% confident that I'm going to make the lift. In fact, the one that I just did felt pretty heavy, and I'm probably not going to make it today. But what usually happens, because I've developed the skill to focus and execute in a certain way, to kind of, put certain things in my mind that pushes all those negative words and thoughts out, I'm able to usually make the lift, even though I didn't believe I was going to, even though I maybe didn't even want to take the attempt. Like, I'm tired. I'm 40 years old now. So it's just a little harder to do a third clean and jerk attempt than it used to be. But, it's interesting to hear you say that. I've never heard someone else say something like, you don't have to have confidence to perform. And it absolutely relates to, what I try to get across to anyone that I work with. And I've got so many things that I want to say, because you said a lot of really good stuff there. But yeah, I've lost my thought already. I'm too scrambled here. I'm not focused.
Right.
But yeah, it's awesome stuff, and hopefully people will take that in and understand you can't force yourself to be confident. You can't force yourself to believe. If you can develop that and gain that over time, yes. I think the main thing is that if you have the desire to do something, a certain skill, you've just got to get in there and keep doing it, and that alone is going to create a certain level of ability in this regard, right?
Yeah, you said something really, really key. I'd love to watch you coach someday. You mentioned, at your age or whatever, when you're at your second or third attempt, you don't necessarily feel like you have it, and so you've got to then figure out where to put your mind so that you're not listening to those judgments.
Mm-hmm.
And so in weightlifting, for example, having a very purposeful routine that you execute from the time that you are ready to start the routine to the point at which you execute your first burst of movement has got to be very purposeful, because if you are
Mm-hmm.
very intentional with what you need to be doing in the moment, then it quiets the judges in your mind. And athletes who are prejudging how they are feeling or how they're going to be doing
Mm-hmm.
need to do what you indicated that you did, which is, where am I going to put my mind? What am I going to be thinking about? What am I going to be doing? That quiets those judges and allows me to put my best effort forward in this moment, regardless of what just happened on the previous lift or what I want to happen on the next one. Where's
Right.
my mind right now? And you are ahead of the game with respect to probably figuring that out on your own, as you indicated.
Yeah, like I said, that's exciting to hear. And honestly, I didn't really figure that out until I started doing more coaching. Coaching for me made me better physically, better technically, because I understood what I was doing and why. So it made me go back and change some of the things in my movement, but it also made me realize what I was doing mentally, focus wise, as a coach, and it helped me be able to develop that. So that's one of the things that I like to tell people that I work with as well. If you're interested in being the best coach you can be, then you need to lift as much as you possibly can, train in weightlifting. And if you want to be a better lifter, I mean, I've told, athletes that are right now pushing for the Olympics at their highest level, I said, hey, if you can, do a little bit of coaching, just on the side, just observe people, even if nothing else, because that's going to make you a better athlete as well. And so it was true physically and mentally for me, for sure.
Yeah. And when you're coaching too, you most certainly are empathetic to what your athlete's going through, and you want them to do certain things, but you're in a little bit more of a clear mindset when you don't have the emotion of you being the performer attached to that. And then that frees up the part of your brain that's responsible for rational thinking when you release some of the part of your brain that's responsible for the emotions that can taint us. And so as a coach, you probably are finding yourself being a little bit more objective in those
Mm-hmm.
moments than you would have been if you were the performer and experiencing the emotion that is clouding your frontal cortex from being free to be able to think about what you need to do.
Right.
And you're also getting older.
Absolutely. There you go.
Comes wisdom.
Yeah. That's a good thing and a bad thing, right?
And
Lenny,
someday when your beard looks this gray and white, people will start listening to you even more. Just wait for that moment.
I've got a few white and gray ones in there. That's for sure.
Oh, it comes quick. I'll tell you that much. So, at any rate, sorry, Dave.
No, not at all. I wanted to bring the new HBO documentary, The Weight of Gold, back in the discussion point because it's it hit a kind of a nerve for me. And if people haven't seen it yet, I would recommend them watching it because I think it's a real thing that people probably don't know about. And I mean, it really kind of highlights this idea of post-Olympic depression and deals with the highest of high-level Olympic athletes in the documentary. Shaun White and Paulo Ono, Michael Phelps, and a lot of these other big-time names that are kind of synonymous with success at the highest level. But it really, I'm sure you deal with it a lot in your field as well with endurance athletes and with really any athlete at any level. But specifically with Olympic athletes, I'm curious if you've seen it firsthand and kind of what steps are being formulated to potentially help athletes figure out ways to cope with what happens when you're done. I mean, this is a very real thing. Like your identity is tied to being an athlete. And what happens when that Olympic moment is over and you're no longer the person who you thought you were. And I'm just curious to get your thoughts because I thought it was a really relevant topic that had been in the media lately.
The more that both you and Chad could be honest, if you did experience similar things as part of your conversation when you talk with athletes, is what it's going to really take. And we're starting to finally see some of the stigma associated with the struggles that athletes who are considered by outsiders to be invincible and to be successful and to be mentally tough. Every time you have a Kevin Love or Michael Phelps or an Allison Schmidt or even Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson be open publicly about the very real struggles of what it's like to be at this level, then it makes it normal and it makes other people not question, well, maybe there's something wrong with me. I mean, from an outsider's perspective, I've had everything. And the more that athletes themselves can lend a voice, which is why those sort of documentaries are ultimately going to be really important, the more athletes are going to be willing to be vulnerable and to recognize that this is far more normal than we expected it to be. I did my master's thesis in 1997, and that was the topic of my master's thesis, was on the struggles of retirement or transition out of sport. And the analogy that I like to use is, let's say that our identity is like a big jigsaw puzzle, and each part of the puzzle is a role that we play or have played in our life. So you might be a father, you might be a student, you might be a coach, you might be whatever. And the totality of those pieces make up a perception of who you are. The bigger the piece of the puzzle, the more powerful that role is in our sense of our value and who we are. And the unfortunate thing for a lot of elite level athletes is they've had to suppress other pieces in their life in that very, very large piece of the puzzle. When their career is about to end, or the Olympics are postponed, or we're cut from a team or whatever, or, you place third at Olympic trials, that could be a really big missing piece of that puzzle. And it's a very, very scary thing. And I think athletes want to feel like, if that piece of me is no longer there, first of all, who am I? How much value do I feel like I have in the world? How much do I perceive other people value me? And so then athletes attempt, not successfully, to fill that puzzle piece. Well, that's going to take a lot of time, and that's not the right approach to that. And so I think that there's the attention that's being paid by athletes who are willing to talk openly about some of those struggles is the beginning of, first, how do I deal with it in the moment and moving forward? But maybe can we go backwards so that at the beginning of their career and throughout their career, they're addressing some of these things and they're not waiting until the end to try to make sense of them, that they have resources in that moment when they're vulnerable to really work on some of this stuff. And I don't have an answer to a lot of this. It's an extremely complex and very serious thing, but I do like the conversation that is finally happening around it, because I've seen this for decades now, and I'm not that old, by the way. My
you're
beard
wise, though. You're wise.
But
we can talk about that beard for a while.
Oh boy, I keep this thing trimmed. At any rate, so what's the path forward? What are we doing to continue to evolve as individuals and find ways that we're valuable to this world, other than a score that comes up on a board after a vault, or kilograms that comes up on the board after we do a squat or whatever? There's more to our lives than that. And the fact that we suppress so much of that along the journey makes it much more difficult at our quote unquote destination, which is the end of a career for an athlete.
I love the analogy of this puzzle pieces, and speaking from the athlete perspective, I think you sometimes get in the mentality of, to succeed, I need my sport to be the whole puzzle. I need one piece to be able to succeed. I can't have all of these extraneous additional puzzle pieces to be able to achieve at the highest level. And so when that puzzle piece gets taken away, you have nothing left. There's nothing else to play with. So it's this idea of, can I have other puzzle pieces that have equal weight and still achieve at the highest level? And I always like to tell this, because I think it's very true, that talent only gets you so far, right? You always hear the work ethic are just important as the talent that elite athlete has, and you can overcome talent discrepancies by putting more hard work in. And it's really difficult to find a balance there if you're saying the work matters to overcome talent, but at the same time, you need to be able to kind of turn off. You need to be able to find other methods to have a life and have a family, have a relationship, and have other interests and hobbies, and these things that take you away from the sport. And this kind of segues a bit into something I heard you talk about before, this idea of kind of symbolically changing your roles. And I looked at it as almost like a Superman effect. And I'd like you to talk about it a little bit. This idea of, you telling athletes not to wear their uniforms to class, or, their jerseys to dinner, and to be able to have a separation in their life from their athletic careers versus their everyday life. And can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think that would be really powerful to be able to create that separation.
Imagine I have a bucket of water. It might be a 5-gallon bucket of water. And I take some food coloring and I drop it in and I stir it up. The entire bucket changes color if I have enough dye. So the bucket is our life, and the food coloring is stress. And so what happens is, if we don't do a good enough job of knowing when to nurture different parts of us other than just the athletic side or the work side, or if you're a surgeon or something, so the goal would be over time is to recognize that I don't have to see myself as a single 5-gallon bucket that the stress is being introduced to. I need to think of it as, I take that water and I put it into separate glasses. And one glass might represent my personal relationships with my family. Another glass might represent my sport. Another glass might represent school. Another glass might represent my career. Another glass might represent my hobby of playing guitar. Another glass. That way, when the dye is put into one of those glasses, say in training or in competition, I do a better job of keeping it from getting into those other glasses. So I'm not taking it home to my girlfriend or my boyfriend or my kids. Or now it's probably not terribly possible to have it be that disconnected, that, because that's not how life works.
Mm-hmm.
But if we are a little bit more proactive with first recognizing that I do have other aspects of my life that are important to me, that I'm being valued by, that I want to judge, and I can do a better job of knowing that I can control the amount that I'm willing to take from one glass to the other. It's the first of all this stuff is controllability, and first recognizing that I have more control over that than I thought I did. And so that's sort of the perspective that I want to help athletes with, is just shifting their perspective that I'm this bucket and whatever happens to me here happens to all my life. And so then having these routines then that we can go from one role to the next, it just takes time to recognize that we could do it, but also to see the importance of it. So when I say for example, if I work with a NC2A athlete and they have a NC2A championship season that's right around the time of midterms or finals, the last thing I want them to do is to show up in their econ class for a final wearing their Stanford gymnastics shirt, because you're carrying all that with you. Nor would I want you to be when you're on the high beam or whatever, to be carrying your econ final with you there. Right. And so I think that it's these physical, transitions are going to be pretty important from that. There was a time when I felt like, the only effectiveness I can have in this field is if I meet with people in person. And so if at all possible, I want you to come to my office, or I want to be able to meet you at a coffee shop, because I felt like that's the best human connection. And then when, Skype and FaceTime and Google Hangouts started to become a lot more developed, and when I started to increase then the reach of the type of athlete I worked with, it became the only way in which I could start working with people. I've worked with international athletes for years and I've never seen them in person. And I feel like I know them as well as I know anybody. It's incredible.
Yeah.
All that. But I was resistant to it at first because I had the old school, I could read you better in person, that sort of thing. But one of the actually unexpected benefits of meeting with people, and so, what's the first thing that when you join a Zoom call, you look in people's backgrounds, you try to get a sense of what's behind them. And when I first started doing this, one of the things that I was able to get at, what I would have never been able to get at if I had met them in person outside of that environment, was how important is their sport for them. And so if I see a young athlete who has a bunch of trophies or ribbons, or I don't see a lot of pictures of them with their friends or things in their room of, then the beginning of thinking, I wonder if this person is a little bit too narrow in their identity. Now, I don't assume that, but Dave, I'm looking behind you. You've got your USA flag up behind you, and these things matter when it comes to how we perceive ourselves, how we view ourselves. And so that's been something that even now, because of COVID and using Zoom and FaceTime more than I'd ever want to, that just highlights this notion of balance and how we see ourselves and how we portray ourselves.
I want to ask one more question on top of that. Sorry.
Please.
Go ahead, finish. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No. It's going to mean that we as a society and sport, coaches, parents, athletes, make it okay to make what you said okay, which is to not put everything into that one basket. And there will be a lot of coaches who say, if you want to be at this level, someone's going to make the sacrifices to do it. Right. And, I agree with that on a lot of points. This is tough. Elite sport takes everything. But the problem is it takes everything, if you know what I mean.
Sure. My question, and Chad, I'll give you a second to chime in, but I just want to build off of one additional thing with regards to next generation, the kids, because it's easy to discuss this from a viewpoint of an adult athlete who is already set in their ways. But really, what we're trying to do is set a precedent and kind of a mentality for the younger kids to be able to say, I can do it now and still achieve success later down the road. First question is, do you work with younger kids on getting, their mental state to be kind of set early on so that they're prepared for what's going to be coming next? And second question on top of that is, what we're seeing a ton of is this prioritization of one sport as early as possible and becoming sports specialized at 5 years old and becoming on a traveling team at 8. And then you are an elite athlete by the time you're 10 years old. And burnout happens by the time they hit their teenage years, or an injury happens much earlier than we would have seen a decade prior, 2 decades prior when we were kids. And I'm curious whether or not we're doing, from your perspective, we're doing enough to be able to prepare the next generation for the challenges that come along with this.
I believe that mental skills should be a required compulsory subject in first grade and second grade and third grade and fourth grade. Not to take away from the importance of learning history and math and English, but children live stressful lives. And it's difficult to say if children's lives are more stressful than they have been in the past. I think when you look at rates of mental health in young people, the numbers are pretty clear that children are experiencing higher rates of mental health than they ever have before. I mean, we're talking about today's children. This is pre-COVID and everything, by the way, compared to the Great Depression and during wars. And so if we're serious about giving children the skills they need to dictate through the challenges of life, because life is hard, we need to be serious about this. And it should be compulsory, mandatory education, mental skills training starting in first grade. And of course, you start what we might consider basic. And then as the demands of childhood and adolescence continue to rise, so too should the sophistication of the skills that they require. Now, good luck me getting that to be passed on the national level when we're dealing with so many other things in this world. But you may not even have to agree with that, but understand the need for it. If I could teach a young person how to listen to themselves and how to prioritize their perception of their worth over what society says they need, or any of these other very basic skills, then we're going to give this generation a chance. So first and foremost, I do believe that we need to start much younger than we typically do. I do work with young athletes. I teach a class in the psychology of youth sports. I've done research on this for a long time. As a matter of fact, I've published quite a bit, and the very first article I ever submitted for publication was accepted with 0 changes.
Wow.
And my doctoral advisor at the time, my doctoral advisor said, this will never happen to you again in your career. You got it out of the way at age 27. And it was a paper on the risks and benefits of youth sports specialization. And I argued extensively over 20 years ago about specialization and the dangers that accompany it. We are finally seeing that there's evidence that diversification leads to higher rates of success. It's taken a long time, but the reality is, if you have talent, that talent's going to be there. And this notion of we have to nurture it when you're 8 years old and we have to give you opportunities, it's total bullshit. If you have talent and you nurture the individual, the person, that talent will be there, and they're going to be good when they're 17 or 18 years old when it's time for them to make a decision. So I want us to shift our perspective on the perceived importance of, identifying talent early on, nurturing that talent by giving them private coaching and restricting their participation in other activities. The evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of let them be kids longer, let them do whatever they want longer. And when they're mature enough to make that decision that they want to do such and such, the talent's going to be there and they're going to mature. So I've said from the beginning, I think that we need to provide a much wider pathway for young people to just have fun longer and
Mm-hmm.
build their, movement repertoire longer.
Mm-hmm.
And I do also think that it will be accompanied with far less rates of burnout and far less rates of stress and far less rates of expectation. Imagine what young people feels when their parents are spending so much money on private coaching and camps and club teams. And it's a lot of pressure on that child to have a return on the investment,
Sure.
and the perception of the child that they're going to let their parents down financially, particularly if the parents are making pretty extreme sacrifices.
Yeah. In all this, to me, we're talking about, kids and people being more well-rounded. And I want to kind of talk about the two extremes here. One, I think I'm definitely on the extreme side of, going back to what we were talking about before with elite athletes and being very narrow with my focus. It was everything in my world to go to training, to take a nap, to go to training again, to compete. My whole world was about that. And I'd neglected everything else in my life, my family, all my relationships, they all suffered. And I can see now looking back that I'm a little bit on the other side, how much they have suffered. In fact, over the last year, I've come to kind of think and realize that I'm probably about 12 years behind, around about 12 years behind, professionally and with my relationships versus someone that I graduated with that, wasn't working towards elite athletics and that kind of thing. So if I could go back and change things or tell myself, or maybe if somebody could have gotten across to me, I'm not sure that someone could have, but if someone would have said in some way, like for me, for example, at this point, I believe that if I would have, put those stressors in different glasses, like you're talking about, instead of all in this one big bucket, I think I would have performed better. I think I would have lifted more weight. I think I would have achieved, an even higher level, because as you were talking about earlier, Dave, those are good distractions, right? And I needed more of those in my life. And I agree with what you're saying about the kids, but at the same time, I feel like there are a lot of, teenagers, maybe young adults, and people that we work with in the CrossFit community that to achieve the goals that they want, they're probably not narrow enough. Would you agree with that? So there's this kind of optimal level that's probably different for different people, but just talking about the other side of that, do we not need a certain level of narrowing our focus to achieve some of the goals that people come to us and say that they have?
I'll ask a question. Would we have wanted Steve Jobs to be less focused with his goals in life? Would we have wanted Martin Luther King Jr. to be less focused with their goals in life? I don't think that's the case. I think anybody who is passionate about changing the world, they're passionate about it. That's where their mind is at. So I don't want to create this false dichotomy of either we are 100% focused on something or we're healthy. I think the question, Chad, is it possible that we can be hyper-focused, as you're arguing, and also do it better, as opposed to either I am hyper-focused or I'm balanced and healthy? That's a hard thing to figure out. And so I would recommend that an individual, regardless of if it's, they're focusing on Olympic weightlifting or on solving the world's problems, that they maintain a passion, but they ask themselves, are they doing it as well as they can? Are they doing it in such a way that, in addition to being passionate and single focused, that they're also nurturing other parts? And if we see it as a dichotomy, then we're stuck, because now it's either I choose excellence or I choose balance. And I don't believe that's the case, but I do believe that we need to have a more balanced discussion of how to do it the right way, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Does me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think the reason why I brought it up is because, my sport, specifically gymnastics, there's a lot of, especially on the women's side, it's a lot of teenage young athletes that are expected to be at the elite level. and they're
Yeah.
pushed at such a rate that, burnout and a lot of other things kind of come along with that. And what we're seeing with COVID, and one of our other Power Monkey team members, Dave Tilley, works very closely with the gymnastics community on creating a healthier environment moving forward. And we're seeing as COVID has taken a lot of the athletes out of the gym, and they're doing, prior to COVID, we're doing 25 plus 30 hours a week in the gym, homeschooling, 100% focus at 12 years old only on gymnastics. And if you ever took a day off, you ever took a vacation, that it was going to be detrimental to your eventual success. Mm-hmm. And with COVID forcing them out of the gym, what we're noticing is, they were able to get back in the gym and they didn't lose their skills. They actually had a much better mindset. They actually were healthier. The rest was a godsend for their bodies. And all of these things that we didn't think were possible were actually incredibly helpful. And COVID kind of forced us to see this. So I just thought it was incredibly helpful that this time gave us a better idea of what the future could look like for our sport.
It's a great point. We're seeing that in other sports as well. I know when swimmers are going back, we're seeing swimmers breaking national age group records right now.
Love it.
And I don't think did they do it despite rest?
Right.
Did they do it because of that, that rest?
Sure.
Well, who's to say?
Sure.
Yep.
Lenny, we've already passed the hour mark, and I know your time is incredibly valuable. Mm-hmm. This topic, I think, needs to be discussed more. And I think, we could go on for quite a bit more time. That would be valuable, not only from the elite athlete perspective, but also from the general athlete, the weekend warrior that, are majority of our listeners. But first, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time and being with us. But before you jump off, would you be willing to answer a couple quick questions for us?
Oh, yeah.
Really quick?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so the first one...
I'm in no rush. First of all, okay.
Yeah. So first one is fairly simple, and you're one of the first guests that I have no idea what answer we're going to get out of it. So we asked everybody, and just curious, what sport or discipline do you prefer, weightlifting or gymnastics?
Define prefer. For me to do? What does that mean? What does it mean prefer?
Which do you think is the better sport, just as a overall, as a spectator, for health and longevity, just a combination of all those things together?
I think if you do gymnastics, you could do anything later. No offense.
Agreed.
Chad. I mean, talk to rock climbers, talk to CrossFit athletes, you name the sport. If you do gymnastics early, you're going to be able to do almost anything later.
Thank you very much, Lenny. It's another check in my box.
Chad, I'll take a look at a weightlifter sitting next to me on a bus if someone tries assaulting me. So,
well, I don't know about that. Hey, if that happens, I'm not going to be of much use to. I'm too soft. I'm too soft when it comes to fighting. I'm a lover, not a fighter. But
you're bigger than I am, so I'm just going to hide behind you either way.
That's true. Well, honestly, I have to agree with that, and that's a good way to put it. I will say that, if you do Olympic lifting long enough, you're probably going to be at least able to do most gymnastic skills fairly well without any training. But again, I mean, and you're going to be a great overall athlete, but you may not have too much of an ability to hang on stuff too long and to climb mountains and stuff like that. So I have to agree with.
I'll give that to you for sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, another check for gymnastics. So thank you very much, Lenny, for that one. Next quick question. Is there another guest that you would love to have on the podcast? You were recommended by Andy recently, and he was an incredible guest for us. And we're curious if there's anyone else that you think would be a good guest for us to have on.
Let's see. I would try to get an extreme sport athlete on the and you can ask them the direct questions of the type of things that I've always been interested in. So maybe a big wave surfer, maybe a wingsuit flyer, and all of them that I've spoken with are extremely well spoken and very insightful. So you might invite a extreme sport athlete on here. back channel you a couple names of people I
Sounds
think would
good.
be good. But
Awesome.
okay.
Love it.
Yeah, that would be amazing. I mean, so much respect and so much, that I don't understand about that. As you mentioned, Lenny, you wanted to understand it and know how in the world that they're even thinking about doing those things. When I think about, I mean, I can't even imagine. I can't even think about beginning to even climb a mountain, even on a rope. I mean, I'm terrified of that kind of thing. So that would be very interesting. I'd love to have, a couple of those guys on for sure. Last question, Lenny, is kind of a two-parter. The first part of it is, do you more prefer to read a book, watch a movie, watch a documentary, a TV series, or listen to a podcast? And whichever of those you prefer, do you have a specific recommendation?
I'm definitely an old school book person, mainly because I could do it anywhere I want. Although I've been walking my dog a lot more and riding my bike a lot more than I've been sort of sequestered in my house. So I've recently started to really try to find podcasts that I really like. So books, boy, I could give you a million of them. It just depends on the level of how much you want to jump into this. I think if you want to get a real good sense of human behavior, then you'll read Robert Sapolsky's Behave.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's a long book, but Sapolsky is one of the greatest thinkers, one of the greatest scientists, but he puts it in a way that is super interesting, informative. If you want to understand human behavior the way that I've attempted to understand it, I would maybe jump in with Behave. There was a great book that was written called How Bad Do You Want It? And that's a book about endurance psychology and really the coping methods that a lot of the world's best endurance athletes use. So How Bad Do You Want It would be a book that I might recommend. I mean, your standard, like, Boys in the Boat type of story of just real life struggles and how people approach those struggles are also pretty interesting.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate those recommendations. Always love hearing those types of things. I'm picking up too much of a list, Dave. Once again,
No, Behave is on my nightstand right now, and so, Sapolsky was one of my college professors, and he was one of the most animated and incredible people. So
That's right.
my human behavioral biology.
Now that's a beard right there.
Oh my God! Wow,
those are beard goals that dude's got.
He's he's an impressive guy. So
well, then
I mean, that book could be your nightstand. It's so big. That could be your nightstand.
Well, I think I'm most interested to check out the beard now. I've got so much beard envy because this is all I can grow, Lenny. It's all patchy over here. I don't feel like a real man, But Lenny, we greatly appreciate you being on. It was an awesome conversation. Learned a lot. Look forward to hopefully talking to you more down the road at some point. Do you have any parting words for our listeners? Anything you'd like them to know about?
As of today, what are we talking about? Almost middle of August. Just, with respect to what we're all going through right now, be forgiving of yourself when you struggle. This is an endurance event that we're all experiencing, and we need to believe that on a day-to-day basis, we can still be good people. We could be who we are and who we want to be, despite all that appears to be going on around us that is out of our control. And it's a decision that we have to make. That I'm stressed, yes. Things are unknown, yes. Can I be a good person? Can I be kind? Can I make connections? Of course you can. So those are my parting words.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Lenny. And for the listeners out there, first of all, go back about a minute or two there and listen to that again, maybe a couple more times and take that in. Certainly good advice and something that we all need to hear at this point in time, as you mentioned, Lenny. And also, guys, be sure to head over to powermonkeyfitness.com. Check out our upcoming services and events. Also, check us out on Instagram for regular teaching and technical content at Power Monkey Fitness, at Dave Durante, and at Ollie Chad. On behalf of Power Monkey Fitness, we're your host. I'm Chad Vaughn alongside Dave Durante. And until next time, guys, thank you all for listening.